She's coming. Thank you. So, thank you. We can begin with 5 minutes of delay. Let me first thank Mr. Abdussalam Bello and Arnaud Buisset, the executive directors of the World Bank Group, to have joined Ferdi to sponsor this event. And before giving them the floor, let me rapidly introduce our very distinguished panelists we have for this important topic. From here to the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, who is a very dynamic Secretary General of the Commonwealth, much involved in the issue of the vulnerability indices, and she will give an advocacy for the youth. Monsieur le ministre de l'Union des Comores, Mzé Chamfiou, qui est le ministre des Comores et en même temps le représentant en quelque sorte du président de l'Union africaine, le président Azali. Donc il part en tant que représentant d'un pays insulaire et très vulnérable, et puis il est aussi la voix du président Azali, qui s'était associé à un événement du même type lors du sommet de Paris, et que je remercie. Nous aurons ensuite les Rabah Fatima. She's the UNSG High Representative for the landlocked, SEEDS and least developed countries. Thank you for joining us. And she will say a few important words about the multidimensional vulnerability index forthcoming at the UN. And after, we have the point of view and maybe the answers of the World Bank with the VP for IDA, Akinisho. Thanks for being here. And of Assatou Diop Nsele, who is also the Vice President for Finance at the African Development Bank. So I give the floor immediately to Abdus Salam, if you can introduce the
So, good afternoon all. Bon après-midi. Merci beaucoup, cher professeur Guillemot, pour l'organisation de cet événement. Special thanks for convening this event, and very glad to be part of the organization team with my very good friend Arnaud Buisset from the French Executive Director Office at the board of the World Bank and IMF. This topic is very critical for our constituent countries. Introducing myself, Abdussalam Bello, I'm from Niger. I'm the Executive Director representing 23 sub-Saharan African countries at the board of the World Bank. And of course, in the context of the evolution roadmap, the issue of vulnerability, but also resource mobilization, and how the institutions should be the MDBs, but the UN system or any other international organization remain relevant in addressing not only the poly crisis, but also having long-lasting results, and having in mind that we have to leave no one behind. Therefore, the issue of vulnerability remains quite critical for us in this agenda. Of course, looking at the 23 sub-Saharan African countries we have also a huge share of small states. 1/3 of our constituent countries are small states, small islands, 8 out of 23. But if you look at the various challenges we have been facing, of course, pandemic, not only COVID-19, but also Ebola and other kind of disease. The climate, drought, flooding, costing also huge portion of GDP. We have seen that recently in Madagascar, for instance, but also in Chad, in Burkina Faso recently, even in Côte d'Ivoire, actually. Recent crises also looking at the small states, just wish to mention them. We have Cape Verde, we have Comoros, and very glad to have our governor from Comoros here, who also here in his capacity of the chair of the African Union. So I believe he will give us also some flavor on how the issue of vulnerability is looked at and addressed from his perspective. Of course, we have Djibouti, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritius, Sao Tome and Principe, among others. We just come from our constituency meeting. We finished about, 25, 30 minutes ago. What did we discuss mainly in this constituency meeting? Resource mobilization, concessionality, how to address the poly crisis, how to make the system more inclusive, more relevant, how to leave no one behind. And this will be also part of the discussion we'll have tomorrow. Our governors will have tomorrow with Ajay Banga during the Africa caucus between the institution, the World Bank, and our African governors, the 54 African governors, top down. And I want to appreciate really the excellent work done by Professor Guillaume in this regard, also making sure that we are remaining focused on the importance of vulnerability. He is convinced, at least on my side, but we need also to keep working with him because he is also a very recognized professor in this, on the development agenda, and how also we partner with him, but also we partner with Arno to widen also the scope, the narrative on the importance of vulnerability in those issues. A couple of issues I want to mention to show the impact recently on the economic of the countries. Country like Cape Verde, which is organized just recently, the Africa caucus in SAL. It's a country that, for instance, heavily rely on tourism. 25% of its GDP is based on tourism, but also which drives also economic activity, accounts to 23% of formal jobs. And the issue of jobs, linking it also with the youth, we were even this at lunchtime with the CSOs. Questions came about the youth, how the institution address the youth agenda, how to make sure that we are providing also not only jobs, but also sustainable jobs, and also helping lift the youth, the women out of poverty in a sustainable manner. So looking at Ferdi's work, I recall the policy brief. I even will show you, Professor, that I can be one of your good students. You have a policy brief 246, April 2023, on where we clearly stated importance to take into account vulnerability, to account namely on 3 dimensions: justice, effectiveness, transparency. Justice, solidarity, international community to provide for vulnerable countries, effectiveness of public development assistance, but also transparency. But those are exactly at the core of what I've been discussing, not only from our concern perspective, but also as the MDBs, as a board of executive director. We want to have a bigger bank, yes, but we want to have also a more effective bank. So those dimensions are remain. Looking at the Sahel countries, some of the challenges are related to what? The social inclusion, the justice, the equity. And transparency also remain fundamental, especially to fight against big word, but important, corruption going forward. Before I stop here, I just want also to emphasize on the solution that we have been looking at, importance of concessional resources to address vulnerability, but also looking at how we develop, strengthen the social contract, the social fabric between states, citizens, but also having worked with the UN Convention on Combat Desertification. We used to talk about what is a social contract also, with or for the nature. Those dimensions also remain, I would say, fundamental. And of course, we are talking about the climate-resistant, resilient debt clauses for the most vulnerable countries, but also on the bank side, the importance of the country climate development reports, which are tools also to help on diagnostic for country vulnerability within the framework of this new World Bank Group model. So therefore, just to say once again, this issue of vulnerability remains critical. We need also to leverage any partnership, should it be with the MDBs, with the UN, with also, of course, the Commonwealth, but also other institutions alike, not to forget the African Union. And very glad also to have the African Development Bank on this panel, in addition to our colleague Aki from the World Bank. I will stop here and wishing you a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Abdul Salam. Bon après-midi à tous. But I wanted to stick to 2 minutes. So 2 minutes, 2 ideas. First, to thank very much Patrick and the Ferdi for convening the meeting. And more than that, his relentless efforts over so many years to bring this topic of vulnerability to the forefront. Our distinguished panelists, of course, and I was so happy to organize that with my dear friend Abdul Salam. So my first point would be why on earth do we need to do more work on vulnerabilities now? I mean, as it has been described, it's really not a new topic. But what I think is that we have new incentives. Of course, one of them, that the climate crisis becomes more and more acute and more apparent, of course. So it's completely straightforward that the need to take into account vulnerability is also more acute. To put it the other way around, not taking into account vulnerability nowadays becomes blatantly inadequate to solve today's development issue. Actually, that has been recognized in many international fora. Let me quote two very recent ones. Here in Marrakesh, of course, President Banque will present the new World Bank mission, and as you know, a world free of poverty on a livable planet. If we go a few weeks before, in Paris, the Pact for People and the Planet says that no country should have to choose between fighting poverty and climate change. To make the link between the aspects of poverty and climate change, you need to have a clear look at what vulnerability means in all these dimensions and how they relate to other dimensions. To put it bluntly, everybody says that we need to pay more attention to vulnerable countries. I think each and every I5 says something like that. Each and every international text says something like that. But what does it mean concretely? And so that's why I go to my second question, how do we do that? And there, of course, I thank the Ferdi, the UN, the World Bank, the MDBs for all the work which has already been done. And I'm sure Patrick will describe it, all our panelists will describe where we are. But it's very clear that at some point we need to talk about something. I mean, I've been raised by a French Catholic mother, so we should not talk about money. But unfortunately, I'm also a treasury guy. And so it's very clear that we need to know how do we allocate the scarce grant resources that we need to tackle vulnerability. And of course, let me give a very extreme example. Even in the richest country, everybody has vulnerabilities. Even in the richest country, in the US, if you take the Manhattan Island is as vulnerable as other islands to the rise if the sea level rises. But of course, the country has the means to prepare and to face that. So we need to link the already multidimensional vulnerability concept that Abdul Salam already started to describe with income. And that becomes much more difficult because in our I5s and MDBs, and I'm sure the World Bank and the African Development Bank will talk about it, it becomes how do we allocate those scarce resources to have the best impact. On our side, of course, there is one very clear point that talking about vulnerabilities cannot come at the expense of the low-income country. So we need to find, actually, to be over-smart, to find a way to mix both those dimensions and find the proper outcome. So that's why I'm so eager to listen to our panelists to find how we will make some progress very quickly because, indeed, as I said at the start, we need it now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Abdul Salam et Arnaud. Thank you very much. Let me take 6-7 minutes just to give an overview of the issue which has been raised by the two executive directors. It's a problem of allocation and eligibility. And as was told, considering vulnerability in the access to concessional resources has been put on the agenda more clearly now than it was in the past years. So I just only try to answer to 5 questions. And the first is why do we consider vulnerability in the access to concessional resources? Vulnerability to shocks, I had no time to explain the concept and so, but vulnerability to shocks, this vulnerability that does not depend on the present will of the government the vulnerability we call the structural vulnerability, is a handicap to development. It's accepted. And there is three main reasons, recalled by Abdul Salam a few minutes ago, for considering this structural vulnerability in the access to concessional resources. The first one, probably the main one, is a question of justice, because tackling vulnerability as a structural handicap contributes to make the opportunities, the development opportunities, more equal. This is the definition of justice at the international level. The second is the issue of effectiveness, because in such an institution as the World Bank Group, everybody wants to be effective. And there is some good results in the literature to show that the marginal impact of foreign resources is higher in the context of vulnerability. And also, and that's very important compared to the other initiatives taken presently, is that building prevention, building resilience is more effective than only relying on ex post and compensation measures. The role of prevention is crucial to tackle vulnerability. And the last one is a reason of transparency. I don't want to be critical to the wonderful schemes of IDA or African Development Funds to take into account vulnerability by one way and another way. But having a good index of vulnerability to introduce in the formula of allocation, avoid multiple windows, exceptions, making the whole scheme difficult to understand, and without, at the end of the day, a very strong impact. I come to the second question, how to do it. How to do it? Two ways. First, as a criterion of eligibility. There is a good step forward in that direction. Eligibility to concessional resources. It may be for IDA, for the concessional resource, for IBRD, for the African Development Bank, for other NA concessional funds to be created or being on the table now. It's well accepted for the eligibility, but as important as eligibility is the issue of allocation. As an allocation criterion, the vulnerability of this resource, concessional resource, allows them to differentiate according to the country needs. It's very crucial because if we accept the vulnerability as a criterion for eligibility without introducing it as a criterion for allocation, it will be unbalanced, and it includes the risk raised by Arnaud in this presentation to have this move towards the middle income only for the introduction of the vulnerability. And it may be addressed, as I say, if the vulnerability criterion is well combined with an index of income per capita, what can be done for allocation, but not really considered for the eligibility. Third question, are there reasons to reject the proposal? In the various presentations we have the chance to produce during the last month, the last years, several objections have been raised. The first one is, of course, we are very committed to considering first the performance. Does it lower the The weight of performance? Not necessarily. There may be a risk, but when we produced several years ago simulation for the African Development Bank, it was clear that we can maintain the share of the best performers, and the reallocation will be between the more vulnerable best performance and the less vulnerable. But the share of the performance will not change after introducing an index of vulnerability in the right way. And the second question already raised is, could it be detrimental for the low-income countries? And that's a very important question today due to the openness of the eligibility of concessional resources to middle-income countries. And it will not be detrimental if the vulnerability criterion is well combined with an income per capita criterion. And in a PBA kind of formula, as everybody knows, the lower the income per capita, the higher the impact of the marginal impact of vulnerability. There is some other objection. I don't know time to consider deeply, but so often you say, is there a problem of absorptive capacity? No, the problem of absorptive capacity is a problem of donors as well as the recipient. And anyway, allocation is not a commitment. And another objection raised during the preparation of the Paris summit is, if you introduce if you have a high index of vulnerability, could it not lead the agencies to attribute bad notation to the country vulnerable? No, because if the vulnerability is introduced is to give more money to the vulnerable, then it should diminish the risk and it will be better for the allocation. And my last question, not last question, it will be developed by the panelists, is can vulnerability be appropriately measured? We have now some indices. An index of vulnerability to be used for eligibility and allocation should meet three principles. First one, it should be exogenous. The index to be considered should be independent of the present will of the country to avoid a moral hazard. The second criterion, second condition, is to be multidimensional, to cover the three main aspects of vulnerability, of structural vulnerability: economic, international fluctuation of prices, environmental, climatic, and also social, the structural fragility, if I say that. And the third point, which has been much debated during the last months at the UN, is to be universal and to be relevant to the various kinds of vulnerability, let's say Sahelian countries as well as SIDS. And I should add that these three conditions are already met, maybe not perfectly, but to a large extent, by the Universal Vulnerability Index developed by the Commonwealth Secretariat and by the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index forthcoming at the UN. And let me try to answer to the fifth question: is it politically feasible? It has been done. It has been done at the UN, by the European Commission for now 9, maybe 10 years. There is an index of vulnerability in the formula of allocation. It has been done by the Caribbean Development Bank. It can be debated. It's a good index done, but it has been done. Another question is political. Is if you change the formula, you have winner and loser, and how to make the loser left at the same previous level. it's quite easier to do when you have an increase of the global amount of resources. It's presently the case of IDA. It's a good time to do that now. And it could be a challenge. And other political issue is that, of course, the index could be adapted to the kind of resources to be allocated, and for the finance allocation to adaptation, it may be a special index of physical vulnerability to climate change and not a general and multidimensional index. So these things are to be discussed, and without a priori, but very pragmatically. And I should say, because I refer several times to the need to maintain performance, a complement to and the right incentive to the reform will be to introduce to include in the CPIA a component for the policy of resilience, and it is for, in particular, with respect to climate, but more generally. Thank you very much. Too long to present the overview, and now we are impatient to hear the advocacy and the answers of the panelists. Let me give the floor first to Right Honourable Patricia Scotland.
Firstly, let me thank our dear friend and comrade in arms, Patrick Guillemot, who has worked on this issue tirelessly and is a font of great wisdom. And ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to be here with you all today, and if I may say so, it's a real pleasure to share this panel with such an eminent number of colleagues. And I know we've shared panels before, so it's not déjà vu, but it is, I hope, going to make a difference. I think I need to be really clear about the Commonwealth's view. Our view is that the case for incorporating vulnerability as a criterion in extending concessional financing is clear. It's unequivocal and urgent. Indeed, across our Commonwealth of 2.5 billion people in 56 nations, and in the world beyond the Commonwealth, the events are really speaking for themselves. We have seen natural disasters in every region of our world, including a devastating earthquake last month, just about 75 kilometers from where we now sit. And these shocks are costing lives and livelihoods, and they're destroying infrastructure and reversing the development gains. And they are interacting with and amplifying the tangled knot of economic, environmental, and security challenges spanning our global systems. So we know that countries facing inherent vulnerabilities, limited fiscal space, and large debt burdens are disproportionately exposed. And in a world facing complex challenges, we share a responsibility to ensure that each country can access the support they need to recover and to build resilience. But the current financial system, ingrained with conditionalities and outdated eligibility criteria, loads the dice against countries in need of vital finance. And the urgency of the situation demands our partnership and our collective action to ensure that the development finance architecture is receptive to the realities of the world today. And access to concessional finance can no longer centre around such a blunt instrument as GNI per capita. This is a priority for the Commonwealth, based on the values of our Charter and the needs of our members and the mandates of our heads of government. Our Universal Vulnerability Index, which we launched in 2021, was driven by the need for a deeper understanding of vulnerability, which is underpinned by quality data. It comprehensively examines economic, environmental, and socio-political realities and highlights structural and non-structural aspects of the vulnerability and resilience. So we unequivocally agree with Patrick's analysis. It complements and indeed has been foundational for the UN multi-dimensional index. And I know we all look forward to the launch of the MVI tomorrow, and I hope its acceptance. But as with any policy development, the real test will be in the application. Vulnerability indicators must become central to the allocation of concessional resources. And multilateral lenders must step up and chart a coherent path to including vulnerability and resilience in its concessional resource allocation. I think Patrick's right. If we don't do that, then the purpose will not be fulfilled. So there is some hope in the funding windows which have been opened. And I'm pleased that 4 of the first 5 countries to gain access to the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Trust were Commonwealth countries. But we should also be honest that these windows have been introduced as workarounds. And there is an overwhelming need for the principles behind them to be hardwired into the global financial architecture. And it's possible to offer sufficient support for countries when they need it and how they need it, if, and it's a big if, we stand together to insist on the use of structural vulnerability criteria in accessing concessional finance. And it's possible to build a new financial system which is more responsive and adaptable to the shocks and which can offer long-term solutions to structural challenges. And building on our work in Paris, today's session, I think, will be highly valuable. And I'm pleased to be able to stand with you all, and I renew the Commonwealth's hand in friendship and partnership in delivering a common future, which is fairer, more prosperous, more secure, and more sustainable for all. And I sincerely hope that our deliberations today can bring forth the much-needed change that is so badly needed. The future of our world is currently uncertain. Geopolitical tensions continue. Recovery from COVID-19 pandemic remains ongoing and subdued, and debt burdens continue to rise, all whilst climate change continues to rear its head at unpredictable and alarming rates. And so I further urge each and every one of us to commit to the discussion on the reform of the global financial architecture and help ensure that vulnerability is included as a criterion for offering concessional development finance. And I would like to echo the sentiments we raised in Paris and urge for a reformed global financing architecture to provide mechanisms for debt sustainability and debt restructuring. By doing so, we will be able to achieve the results we want for a future and benefits that will benefit all of us and leaves no one behind. I think we can do this. We must do it. It's a matter of choice. We have the choice. It is ours to make, and I hope we will make that choice. And I thank you all once again, not only for being here, but being part of the solution to the problems we face, all of which I believe are soluble if we choose.
Fatima, will you take the floor now from your seat or from... Okay. I take your seat. Yes. On here.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Guillermo. And Excellencies, distinguished panelists, dear friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to join this distinguished panel, and particularly to see that we all share the same commitment to bring about a change in how we deal with the issue of vulnerability and access to concessional funding. And I would also like to thank you, Professor, for putting so well into context our discussion here. Thank you very much. The issue of tackling, taking vulnerability into account in determining access to concessional financing is central to the work of my office, which supports the world's 92 most vulnerable countries, the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states. Each of these groups face unique challenges to fulfill the development aspirations. They need enhanced access to concessional financing to overcome those and build resilience against crises and shocks. Take, for instance, the least developed countries, the LDCs. They represent the world's most economically disadvantaged countries. Out of the 26 low-income countries, 24 are LDCs. These nations also face structural challenges, including inadequate productive capacities. Then take, for instance, the landlocked developing countries, the LLDCs, who lack direct access to the sea, making them highly dependent on neighboring or transit countries for international trade and all other needs. They also suffer from connectivity issues and other infrastructural hurdles. And furthermore, it may also be noted that out of the 32 LLDCs, the landlocked countries, 17 of them, that is more than 50%, are also LDCs, and 16 of them are in Africa. And the SIDS, the small island development countries, are particularly susceptible to climate change-driven impacts. A single disaster, as we all know, can be catastrophic, wiping away years of development gains in a matter of minutes, devastating industries or crucial infrastructure. Recent findings by the International Institute for Environment and Development revealed that the percentage of SIDS populations affected by disasters has surged by approximately 120% over the last decade. There must be a paradigm shift. We keep on talking about it, but there must be a paradigm shift in our approach to financing for development in these groups of countries to help them tackle these challenges and build on sustainable and resilient future for them. The current architecture for accessing concessional finance, however, heavily relies on GNI per capita as the primary criteria for eligibility. Consequently, many countries, many of these vulnerable countries who are vulnerable to exogenous shocks find themselves excluded. For a long time, a question facing the international development community has been, how do we resolve this issue in a comprehensive manner by taking into consideration different dimensions of vulnerability? The establishment of the high-level panel on multidimensional vulnerability index, the MVI, in March 2022 by the President of the UN General Assembly primarily aimed to address this issue. The panel submitted its final report in September this year. It proposed an MVI, which constitutes quantitative benchmark measuring structural vulnerability or lack of structural resilience across multiple dimensions of sustainable development at the national level. We greatly appreciate the sustained efforts from the SIDS to advocate for an MBI over the course of the last 3 decades. And I believe that the MBI proposed by the high-level panel is an important contribution to that endeavor. An MBI that enjoys broad political consensus can help resolve many long-standing issues, including for access to concessional financing. The SIDS, LDCs, and the LLDCs are at the forefront of multiple interconnected vulnerabilities and external shocks. SIDS in particular have emphasized that the traditional development metrics inadequately capture their vulnerabilities, which result in substantial challenges to access to adequate financing. The allocation of external financing by IFIs, such as the World Bank, does not adequately consider their vulnerabilities, thus excluding them from concessional windows of financing. Distinguished colleagues, the fundamental tenet guiding the work of the MBI was to provide all developing countries with an opportunity to access global-level support based on their structural vulnerabilities. Essentially, the MBI does not seek to replace GNI per capita, but it aims to complement it. The success of the MBI will largely depend on its ability to expand the opportunities of all vulnerable countries to access enhanced funding. By taking a comprehensive approach towards the measurement of vulnerability, the MBI can serve as a valuable tool to enhance financial commitments, including ODA. I was encouraged to see a reference to the assessment of vulnerability criteria for concessional allocation in the reports to the governors on World Bank evolution for the Development Committee meeting to be held here in Marrakesh on the 12th of October. This is an important step, and I look forward to World Bank's further consideration in integrating the MBI into its work and practices which will fulfill the aspirations of all vulnerable countries. Before I conclude, I wish to, Patricia Scotland, my dear friend, has also mentioned it, but I'm pleased to invite you to a press event on the MBI results tomorrow, the 11th of October. It will be held at the Adam Park Hotel at 12:30. The MBI results will be explained in more detail during the event by both by the co-chairs of the high-level panel. The report clearly indicates that these groups of countries, the LDCs, LLDCs, and the SIDS, unequivocally represent the most vulnerable countries. My office, dear colleagues, will continue to advocate to mobilize further political support for the MBI and the world's most vulnerable countries. We must keep in mind that addressing vulnerability and enhancing resilience are the most essential measures to achieve the SDGs and fulfill our shared vision and commitment to leave no one behind. I'll rest it here, and thank you very much, and apologies for the extra time taken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After these 2 wonderful advocacies, we need to hear the point of view of the Minister of vulnerable countries about that. You can... Oui, bien sûr, vous parlez en français. Pas de problème.
Il n'y a pas de traduction.
Il n'y a malheureusement pas de traduction, mais tout le monde comprend le français ici ou presque.
Très bien, très bien. Très court. Merci bien, professeur. Je vais devoir parler en français. Je pense que la majorité de la classe, de la salle, comprennent le français. Très bien. Bonjour à tous, chers panélistes, chers professeurs. Je suis très heureux et très honoré de prendre part à ce panel important consacré à la vulnérabilité multisectorielle, qui concerne pratiquement la majorité des pays africains, notamment les petits États insulaires comme les Comores, les Seychelles, l'île Maurice ou tant d'autres. Je pense que ce panel, c'est le meilleur moment de tirer les enseignements de l'impact multisectoriel, de l'enchaînement des chocs exogènes, les chocs climatiques, les chocs sanitaires, sécuritaires, mais également les conflits, avec des conséquences économiques, sociales et environnementales sur l'économie mondiale, notamment sur les économies des pays en développement, en particulier les pays africains les plus vulnérables. Cette cascade de crise a un impact dévastateur sur les pays les plus pauvres et les plus vulnérables qui doivent relever beaucoup de défis. Les défis climatiques, où nous savons que plus de 36% de la population africaine est exposée à ces chocs climatiques. Les défis sanitaires, où nous avons effectivement tiré les leçons de la crise Covid, où la majorité des pays et de la population africaine a eu des difficultés à vacciner, mais également des chocs alimentaires avec la crise et l'impact de la guerre en Ukraine, mais également l'impact inflationniste qui accentue la vulnérabilité et qui accentue également la pauvreté, et surtout les mesures qui sont prises par les banques centrales pour augmenter les taux d'intérêt et qui ont encore accentué ces difficultés en enchérissant le coût du capital. Et cela, bien entendu, accentue les difficultés de financement du secteur privé et du financement aussi des pays en difficulté. Des défis également de la lutte contre la pauvreté, des défis pour l'accès à l'eau potable et à l'énergie. Donc ces exemples montrent à quel point la question de la vulnérabilité est une question fondamentale qu'il va falloir réellement porter au niveau des institutions multilatérales. Cette vulnérabilité est une réalité et pourtant l'allocation des ressources financières au développement ne tiennent pas compte de ces facteurs de vulnérabilité. Face à cette situation, il est légitime de revendiquer la mise en place des instruments nouveaux de couverture et d'atténuation de ces chocs exogènes. Il va falloir naturellement mutualiser les risques, mais aussi amortir ces chocs en mettant en place des instruments de couverture et surtout d'amortissement de ces chocs. L'Afrique ne doit pas supporter le fardeau du changement climatique, raison pour laquelle notre plaidoyer pour la mise en place et pour la prise en compte des fragilités structurelles dans l'allocation des ressources concessionnelles constitue une question de justice sociale. Ça a été effectivement évoqué. Nos États doivent continuer le plaidoyer pour la mise en place d'un indice de vulnérabilité multidimensionnel pour l'allocation des ressources qui prendrait en compte les vulnérabilités structurelles, les vulnérabilités économiques, les vulnérabilités environnementales. Ces allocations permettront aux pays vulnérables exposés aux chocs exogènes de prévenir l'impact des chocs exogènes et de renforcer leur résilience. Les réformes en cours au sein de la Banque mondiale et des banques multilatérales de développement doivent tenir compte de ces innovations en mettant en place ou en tenant compte de ces propositions qu'il va falloir que nos États continuent de porter et de défendre. En effet, les statistiques de la Banque mondiale montrent que 9 États sur 10 les plus vulnérables sont des États africains. Lors du sommet sur la finance mondiale, le président de l'Union africaine, le président Azali Assoumani, a fortement insisté et soutenu la recommandation du sommet qui consiste à allouer davantage de ressources concessionnelles aux pays les plus vulnérables pour atténuer les impacts du changement climatique à travers la définition d'un instrument qui prend en compte ces questions de vulnérabilité. Je terminerai par l'exemple d'un pays insulaire, les Comores, qui est mon pays, emblématique pour sa position géographique, qui est exposé régulièrement aux chocs exogènes. Chaque année, pratiquement chaque année, la montée des eaux touche pratiquement toutes les villes et les villages qui sont côtières. En 2019, nous avons connu un cyclone de 24 heures qui a causé des dégâts matériels et des impacts énormes, d'où le coût ou les dégâts ont été évalués à 277 millions de dollars, qui constituent 3 fois le budget du pays. Donc vous imaginez à quel point mobiliser 277 millions de dollars pour relever la population ou pour reconstruire le pays est un fardeau important. C'est pour cette raison. Vous comprendrez pourquoi. Nous plaidoyons pour une vision en profondeur des critères d'allocation de ressources qui prendraient en compte les critères de vulnérabilité multidimensionnelle et qui fait l'objet de ce panel. Et nous saluons effectivement l'organisation de ce panel important, qu'il va falloir porter cette idée de mise en place d'un indice de vulnérabilité. Merci de votre aimable attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le ministre, d'avoir relayé le plaidoyer des 2 précédentes oratrices par le point de vue du terrain et d'un pays particulièrement vulnérable et d'avoir exprimé en même temps le point de vue du président de l'Union africaine sur l'intérêt que vous portez à ce que la vulnérabilité soit prise en compte, non seulement dans l'éligibilité, mais j'ai bien noté sur l'allocation. Alors maintenant, il est très important d'entendre le point de vue des représentants des 2 grandes banques multilatérales de développement qui concernent l'Afrique. First, Aki Nisho for the World Bank. Thanks to give the floor and give us your reaction about this advocacy.
Okay. D'abord, je voudrais commencer avec quelques mots pour le professeur Guillemot, parce que pendant ces dernières années, des éléments de vulnérabilité ont été introduits dans le cadre de IDA. Et c'est grâce à Patrick qu'on a commencé un guichet pour réponse aux crises. C'était il y a 15 ans. Et c'était après des échanges sur l'idée du exogenous shocks window qui a donné naissance à ce guichet-là. Alors, je vous remercie beaucoup pour tel discours qu'on a eu pendant des années. I'm going to now switch to English. I'd like to just elaborate a little bit on what I just said about how we have introduced elements of vulnerability in the IDA framework. We have actually introduced it in several different ways, maybe not through a particular index, but in different ways, and I'm going to explain what they are. So first, we have under IDA what we call the Small Island Economies Exception Policy. And this is many small island economies which have GNI per capita that exceeds the cutoff for accessing IDA resources. So I did hear some concerns about using GNI per capita, but actually we have used it flexibly so that we look at vulnerability when defining which countries are eligible for concessional funding, even those countries which are relatively elevated in terms of per capita GNI. And the policy provides exceptional IDA access for qualifying small island states, and since March 2019, The policy has explicitly factored vulnerability to natural disasters and climate change into these decisions to include or not include countries under the exception. Altogether, 17 small island countries have access to IDA resources today because of this policy. If this policy did not exist, they will not have access to IDA. They will only be eligible for IBRD. Next, IDA's graduation process factors vulnerability in when assessing the country's readiness to move to IBRD or graduate to IBRD. This helps ensure that we do not transition countries to IBRD prematurely, i.e. before they are ready. And once countries have gained access to IDA, vulnerability also impacts the volume of IDA funding that they receive through national allocations or PBA. Our formula for allocating resources include a base or minimum allocation. All countries receive this regardless of population or other performance factors. This means the base allocation disproportionately benefits small states. We quadrupled this base allocation 6 years ago when IDA 18 began. We have also measures for increasing resources for IDA countries experiencing fragility, which is another dimension of vulnerability. IDA's FCV envelope provides tailored and large-scale top-up support to help eligible countries address drivers of fragility. Since its establishment in IDA 19, 14 countries, many of them in Africa, have accessed funds through this FCV envelope. Both IBRD and IDA also adjust financing terms to favor vulnerable countries. IDA offers its most concessional lending terms to small economies. These small economy terms offer no interest loans with 40-year amortization and a 10-year grace period and have a grant element of 61%. The small islands exception policy that I mentioned earlier allows eligible countries which are in principle gap countries to be reclassified as IDA only. Sorry, this is very jargon-centric, but that's how they are classified. So if the debt risks rise for these countries under the special exception, they can have access to 100% grants if they are classified as what we call red light countries. Moreover, in IDA 20, IDA-only small states at moderate risk of debt distress are further shielded from the permanent transition to 50-year credits for countries with this debt profile and continue to be eligible for 50% grants and 50% credits. In general, IDA prioritizes the poorest countries with high debt vulnerabilities when considering access to grant terms. Now, there are also IDA's most favorable rates available to the borrowers, which exempt these countries from the price increase introduced as part of the 2018 capital increase package. So in addition to access volume and terms, let me highlight that we work with IDA countries to reduce debt vulnerabilities and help them prepare for crisis. For instance, what we do for debt through the SDFP or Sustainable Debt Finance Policy. When a crisis hits, IDA's crisis response window, this is what I just mentioned earlier, offers a source of supplemental support. In IDA 20, our current cycle, it has been drawn down very rapidly in a kind of unprecedented way to the point where our shareholders endorsed the IDA crisis facility through which we hope to top up resources in the window. So that covers the main elements of what we offer today through IDA and IBRD. But there is also always scope to improve. And that brings me to some of the new ideas that we are discussing through the evolution. For instance, we are updating and expanding our crisis toolkit. As part of this effort, we will introduce the climate resilience debt clauses, or the CRDCs, to the most vulnerable IBRD and IDA clients. These CRDCs will allow the most vulnerable clients to temporarily defer principal repayments when they experience a severe natural disaster. Also, through the evolution, we are exploring incentives for IBRD countries to invest in projects that address global public goods, and especially those with cross-border externalities. As we design this framework, we will look into integrating vulnerability in decisions that allocate concessional resources. Finally, in NIDA, we recognize that many small states that are not islands experience similar vulnerabilities. So we are currently considering a proposal to extend our small islands exception to those countries as well. I have covered quite a bit of technical detail in a short period, and let me end with a thought. Well, actually, a couple of thoughts. One is that we take a layered and comprehensive approach to addressing a wide range of vulnerabilities. And as vulnerability evolves, we are also working to evolve our approach. So we are constantly wanting to learn from you, learn about the UN indicators that are coming, learn from many things that are being put on the table. The other point I wanted to make was quite apart from the issue of how we factor vulnerabilities into our allocation methodology. If you look at the trends in global aid architecture, the fund flows to countries that are at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. So these are red light countries, and I think you will agree that they are very vulnerable. So the fund flows to these countries have become less and less concessional. And that is something that we have to fix. Now, in the case of IDA, if you have a red light country, you only give 100% grants. And I think that's the kind of approach that I think should be practiced more widely. So I think that's all from me. Let me close by ending that the last point about the need to help the vulnerable countries. I think it also speaks to the need to have a very ambitious IDA 21. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, actually, for this answer on what you are already doing without yet introducing an index of vulnerability in your PVA formula and to change to performance and vulnerability allocation based, the PVBA asset. Please,
thank you.
This point of view of the African Development Bank.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting the African Development Bank Group at this very important event, ladies and gentlemen. Vulnerability and fragility are central issues for Africa. 21 of the 30 most fragile countries are in our continent. And unfortunately, as you can expect, fragility and poor developmental outcome reinforce one another. Vulnerable countries have a very strong informal sector, very high unemployment rates, in particular for the young and the women. And actually, I don't need to make the case. You all know these facts. And fragility is associated with high poverty rate, food insecurity, infrastructural and public services deficiencies, no economic diversification, and institutional weaknesses. And to compound this, the facts and our experience show that the private sector is reluctant to invest in these countries. Hence, fragile countries remain stuck in a poverty trap. With climate change exacerbating fragility, it compromises human security and livelihoods and uproots communities. It increases violence with inadequate state capacity acting as an aggravating factor. So there is a feedback loop which can have a very debilitating economic and social effects. So fragility is a continuum. The political situation, security, justice, economic performance, social cohesion, regional spillovers, climate change, and the environment are only a few of the multiple aspects and root causes along which pressures may manifest itself. So this is why, like you, at the African Development Bank, we take questions related to vulnerability very seriously in how to allocate our resources. So I noted what you highlighted, Patrick, in your invitation on the conclusions of the Paris Summit, where you said to attenuate vulnerabilities, there is a need to identify the conditions and criteria under which concessional low-cost finance could be mobilized to tackle global challenges and to ensure that this would not negatively impact poorest countries' allocation. So how we use it is important. But even more important is the availability of substantial resources to make a real impact. So we can have the best vulnerable index, the best allocation principles possible, but if we do not have sufficient resources to support this exercise, which is the case today, we will continue to talk vulnerability and fragility in the years to come. So the reality is low-income countries, fragile countries, after receiving grants and concessional resources, go to capital markets and other lenders at unsustainable levels out of sheer desperation. So we have to tackle the elephant in the room, the low volume of concessional resources made available to these countries. So at the African Development Bank, and in particular the African Development Fund, which is our concessional lending arm, we have been at the forefront of issues related to fragility and vulnerability. We don't have a choice. This is our arena. So in 2001, we were one of the first organizations to incorporate fragility into our operations and created a facility in 2004, the post-conflict countries in paying back their debts. I'm smiling here because of Sundar, who was, at the African Development Bank at the time and now with the World Bank. So we modified our performance-based allocation to direct more resources to countries that have experienced conflicts. So we launched a transition support facility, recognizing that fragile and vulnerable countries have structural constraints which prevent them from having the same level of performance as other countries. And that is essential. And 6 years ago, we worked with you, Patrick, with you and your team, to evaluate the effects of adding vulnerability indices into our ADF PBA formula and transition support facility. And the insights provided by Ferdi proved to be very useful. And I would like again to thank your team and you for the excellent work and the level of and quality of our collaboration. And it's actually following this work that the ADF, the African Development Fund deputies, agreed to modify our PBA allocation to replicate the results. And more recently, during our last African Development Fund replenishment, we introduced a more programmatic approach for transition support facility. And we're quite excited about this because it allows more resources to be directed to help preventing conflicts in Africa, thus helping the root causes of fragility. It addresses pockets of fragility at the regional or subnational levels. And we believe that the strategic impact and crisis management will benefit from that increased operational flexibility. So we have crowded in private sector investments through innovative instruments such as guarantees, private sector credit enhancements to de-risk operations. But there are significant challenges for attracting private sector investments and financing transformative infrastructure projects. And why am I talking about the private sector? It's because development of our countries cannot happen without significant private sector investment. So our resources are used to address the root cause of fragility, and our financial instrument offerings, in particular grants, are fit for fragile context. And Akito talked about the climate resilient debt clause, which we fully believe in and we agree. We believe in such debt poses, but not just for climate. It has to be for events also that cripple in economies and that shouldn't lead governments to choose between paying their debt or addressing those vulnerabilities. So there is a need to significantly increase the volume of resources for these countries. And again, as I said, having the best allocation rule will only go so far if resources are severely constrained. Donc, comme l'a si bien dit le ministre des Comores, oui, la vulnérabilité est une question fondamentale. Alors oui, Patrick a un indice de vulnérabilité multidimensionnel, universel et séparable, mais tout d'abord et avant tout, il nous faut les ressources. Merci.
Thank you so much, Aissatou, for stressing the link between the volume of resources and the clarification of the criteria and the commitment of the bank to address seriously the vulnerability issues in its various dimensions. And this link between the volume and the strategy is very important. We have, let me ask, have we the room to listen one or two questions? We have to, is there one or two very brief remarks? Very brief. 1 minute, please. Introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you everyone for the very insightful presentation. My name is Kamal El-Harti, and I'm advisor on sustainable finance, working with the Champagne Center for Food and Climate, Swiss think tank. Especially, we are running an inquiry on how to increase the effectiveness of ODA and the use of blended finance to tackle the issues of food security in Africa and developing countries. And when you spoke earlier about Ms. Nsili, about the issues of market failures in developing countries, what are your thoughts about the fact that only 2 to 3% of ODA is used to mobilize, is used toward blended finance? So in that regard, I would like to know what's your thought on that. Thank you.
Just another question, 1 minute. Madam, I don't see you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Rebecca Fabrizi. I'm the UK Government Special Envoy for Small Island Developing States. This is a really fantastic panel with such a great representation, and thank you very much also to the UN for the work on this index. My question is specifically for Mr. Nishio, if you could say something about how you think you might be able to engage with a broader vulnerability index as the World Bank. That would be really interesting. Thank you.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux demander à Abdou Salam et Arnaud dire 2 mots de conclusion, non? Ou peut-être des panélistes qui veulent réagir à 2 questions qui ont été posées? En une phrase ou 2?
Est-ce qu'on m'entend? Je ne sais pas si mon micro est activé.
You have a micro.
Est-ce qu'il est activé? Je ne sais pas s'il est activé.
Oui.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you very much for your question. I didn't know that only 3% was used of ODA was used for blended finance, but I think that blended finance is the way to go. I think that if all countries had maybe the means or the I wouldn't say the willingness, but the means to provide concessional resources, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in. And the next best thing is blended finance. The African Development Bank is starting with the blended finance principles. I mean, we've done some blended finance transactions, but I think that is the way to go. The African Development Fund, for example, which is as I said, the soft loan lending arm of the African Development Bank, like IDA, is going to capital markets to raise resources at AAA level, hopefully, and lend them as a moderate concessional loans. But these resources, we want to blend them with trust fund. We want with grant money in order to make sure that we have the right type of finances for the right type of projects, because blended finance also has to follow specific principles. You cannot just blend to fund private sector projects. So I think I think that we should see more of that, at least on the African Development Bank side.
Thank you. If there is no other question, Aki,
The second.
you should say.
Okay, maybe just very quickly, just to say that we are engaging very closely with other MDBs, in particular the IDB, because they started this. And we are also in touch with the different shareholder constituencies in the World Bank at the board, getting their inputs, and also talking to the credit rating agencies to see what are the impacts on IDA's finances. So I think the only way to move forward with this new product is by consulting widely to understand what are the risks and opportunities we have, So, we have made a start, and we will continue to evolve this product so more people can benefit from this product.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. If there is no other important question, there should be some important question, but we have to leave the room. Let me apologize for having badly managed time. It's an example, another example that eligibility to speak is not enough if you have not a good rule of allocation of time. Thank you.